Oh, hello! My name is Mara, and welcome to Books Like Whoa. It has been a very long time since I have done a Know Your Tropes video, and because it is Nonfiction November, I thought that November could be a great time to do a Know Your Tropes nonfiction edition. Now, you may be thinking to yourself that it is weird to talk about like genre-related things in nonfiction because like, isn't that only fiction? No. Nonfiction as a written form, a written style of book, has its own conventions, its own kind of micro genres within nonfiction in terms of subject matter, type of writing, all kinds of things like that. So I think you can definitely meaningfully talk about different types of nonfiction and what you do and don't like. So that's why I wanted to make this video, because if you don't know, this is in my Know Your Tropes series, and the whole purpose of this series is to talk about what I do and don't like in different kind of groups of books. So I've done one on like mystery, I've done one on YA, I've done one on fantasy, like a lot of different types of books. And I talk about the things that I do and don't enjoy because I hope that will inspire you to think about the things that you do and don't enjoy within different genres. Because I think that one of the most empowering things that you can have in your toolbox as a reader when you are out in the world looking for things to read is to know your own taste enough that you can effectively pick books that you are likely to like. And talking about tropes, and actually I've gotten this comment a few times recently, to define what I mean by a trope is, you can often think of it as sort of like the little individual building blocks that make up a certain type of book. So it may be, in a fantasy book, a chosen one character, that is a known trope in that genre. There's a lot of different iterations. Basically, you can almost think of it like a bookish meme, like something that gets repeated over and over again in different ways and therefore takes on sort of intertextual meaning beyond an individual book. I'm fascinated by this kind of stuff, by the way. I love thinking about how individual books play on known genre conventions and known character things like that to build meaning that extends beyond the text. Anyway, so you can think about it in things like that. You could also, like in the romance genre, a plot trope would be friends to lovers. That's a specific micro genre that kind of builds up what an individual book is like. You also have tropes in the form of how books are written. So for instance, there's a certain type of YA writing style that is first person present that can almost become its own trope of like the first person present tense narrator and kind of like the types of things that they think and put into the authorial voice can almost become sort of like a trope. So anyway, it's all the little things that make up that individual book, but that it shares with other books in its genre. So today we're going to talk about nonfiction tropes. And what I realized is that I had a hard time thinking of things that I don't like in nonfiction. Mostly this is going to be a love fest of things that I do like in nonfiction. But I will start by saying that at a high level, things I don't like in nonfiction include very navel-gazy memoirists who don't really have enough of either a beautiful writing style nor interesting life experience to warrant the kind of book that they've created. I also, on the kind of same vein as memoir, I often don't prefer kind of memoirs that take over the scope of someone's life. I usually want them to sort of have like an angle on it. I struggle with really dry prose style if the book is not purely informative. So like if I'm reading a book, a nonfiction book that is pure, like 100% informative, I am reading this because I'm trying to learn how to do something. Or if you're in school, you're reading it because you need to write a paper and like you need the information in this thing, like you need to do something with it. I'll put up with it. But if I'm reading nonfiction for pleasure, unless the topic is just extraordinarily interesting and it can surmount the prose style being very dry, I'm probably not going to like it. So those are kind of at a high level some things I could think of nonfiction that I just sort of like categorically don't enjoy. But mostly I'm going to be talking to you guys about some of the things that I really love, and I was going to talk about them at a high level and then do examples at the end. But I'm just going to go through like the like 10 stacks of books that I have here with examples of what I'm talking about. And I'm going to tell you guys things that I love most in nonfiction, the types of nonfiction that I like most, and we'll just go from there. So we're gonna start with memoir because I think I would say if I had to pick one genre of nonfiction that is my favorite, it probably is memoirs / memoir personal essay kind of things. And what I've discovered, my biggest kind of trope preference within that subgenre of nonfiction is that I prefer memoirs that have a very specific angle to them. So like I want them to either be talking about a specific time period in their life, or I want them to be looking at the whole of their life story with a very specific angle into how they're going to tell that story. So some examples of what I mean by that. So first of all, oh, this is really heavy. Let's see if I can hold it. Oh, it's just rested up here on my shoulder. March, which is a trio of graphic novels, which is an autobiography graphic novelization of John Lewis, Representative John Lewis's life, but it is specifically the time period of when he was a part of the civil rights movement in the 60s. And each book is kind of chronicling that window. So yes, in the first one, does it kind of give you an overall like, yeah, here's where I was born and whatever? It does. But really this isn't coming up to the present. This is only talking about a specific time in his life. And actually, I believe that there's going to be a sequel series called Run when he ran for Congress and like his time as a congressman. But I like that this is not trying to tell the whole of his life story. It's focused in on one specific. Along that same vein, my all-time favorite memoir is Julia Child's My Life in France. And this is specifically mostly talking about how she fell in love with cooking and food and kind of the culmination of that into mastering the art of French cooking. And so it's a specific time in her life and it's mostly in France, hence My Life in France, but the writing in this is exquisite. And because it's like looking at this specific moment, it feels more focused. And this is just this book is just the embodiment of joy. Like it's just such a joyous and lovely book. But I really like that it's so focused. There's that kind of is specific time frame. And then these other three are more that there's a specific angle on the storytelling. So first, When Women Were Birds is a memoir that's focused on Terry Tempest Williams. Her mother passed away and she comes from the Mormon faith, her family does. And there's this huge tradition of journal writing, and her mother left her all of her journals, and when she went to look at them, all of them were blank. And so this entire book is basically a reflection on faith, nature, actually, and just like what it means to be a woman. So it's the story of her life, but it has that sort of incident as the kind of guiding metaphor through which she's like evaluating the whole of her life. Hunger by Roxane Gay is basically about Roxane Gay telling the story of her life through the lens of a horrific sexual assault incident in her life and how that led to her essentially having an eating disorder for her adult life. And so that is the lens through which everything is told. And then Stephen King's On Writing. This is sort of like we'll talk about actually another example of this in a little bit. It's sort of a blend between a memoir and a style guide for advice giving for writing. But really, I think this reads much more like a memoir, but like through the lens of him as a writer. So, you know, you get the whole scope of his life, but the focus is always on how things are impacting his growth as a writer. So those are some examples of like my favorite types of memoir. And I would recommend all of those highly. They're some of my favorite books. Then if I had to pick a second favorite genre of nonfiction, I probably would say Histories of Ideas is probably my second favorite. So a recent one that I absolutely loved was Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram X. Kendi. You guys heard me talking about that book all the time in 2018. But a couple of other just examples that I found on my shelves. One is Sources of the Self, The Making of Modern Identity. This is basically an intellectual history kind of from the pre-Greco-pagan tradition through, let's say, like 2000, ideas of how humans have thought about the idea of what it means to have a self. So this was really interesting, and actually a pretty similar title would be Inventing the Individual, The Origins of Western Liberalism. So it's a shorter book and a shorter scope. But again, this idea of how the idea of individualism came to be as we know it today. And then The Big Fat Surprise by Nina Teicholz. This is a history of how we got specific food regulations in the US and sort of the nefarious influences that kind of skewed science or like push different voices in the scientific community out at key junctures, like in the late 70s and early 80s, and like how that has had kind of a bad effect on the direction that our overall health regulations and guidelines have progressed in the US. So this is sort of a history of scientific ideas, a very specific one, like a micro look into that. So anyway, that is probably my second favorite genre. And the rest of these I think I can't prioritize, so we'll just go in random order. Well, no, actually, sorry, I take that back. My third favorite type of nonfiction is investigative journalism, where it's basically the story of how the story got told. My favorite nonfiction book, period, ever is All the President's Men by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. You guys have heard me talk about that, which is like the ultimate version of this trope. But recent ones that have been really good include Bad Blood by John Carreyrou. This is the story of Theranos, but the back half of it reads like John Carreyrou getting the story about Theranos. Like, I just love it when we get to see like all the ways people tried to stop people from getting the truth out. Oh, I just love it. It feels sort of like a spy thriller to me. So this book definitely has an element of that. And then another great recent example that has come out is Catch and Kill by Ronan Farrow. I would say She Said by Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey has some of this, but I think it's even more strongly present in Catch and Kill. And basically it's about the story behind the story of the Harvey Weinstein scandals that came out 2 years ago, like all the reporting that happened, and it's fascinating. So that, I will say that's my third favorite. The rest of these will be in no particular order. One category of things I really like are histories of women and like feminist histories, or like telling the stories of women that haven't been told. So some examples of what I have enjoyed over the year in that category is Fundamentalism in Gender, 1875 to the Present, by Bendroth. This is a history of gender in American religion. And actually, very similarly, is Ungodly Women, Gender in the First Wave of American Fundamentalism. Pretty much the same topic. Both of these are really good. Trainwreck by Sadie Doyle is basically a pop culture history of women who have been like scandalous in some ways, and like women basically that society loves to hate and why. So this was really interesting. Here's a source book, In Her Words by Amy Oden. This is women's writings in the history of Christian thought. So basically this is like own voices for Christian philosophy throughout the ages. So this is really cool. And then Family Fortunes by Davidoff and Hall. This was like a foundational text in the study of the evolution of gender roles from like 1800-ish. Well, where does it say? Oh, 1780 to 1850. Okay. So this is like foundational, kind of like where did the whole idea of like the Victorian idea of womanhood come from? This is super interesting. I don't totally agree with it, but it's a very provocative argument and very foundational to this area of study. So those are all examples of like women's history stuff I like. Then I love nonfiction that is about writing or writing advice. So I just picked two of my favorites. So Flannery O'Connor's Mystery and Manners. These are essays about writing. They are very memoirish in some places, but I think it's more in the area of sort of like advice, like writing advice or her philosophy or approach to writing. And then my favorite book on editing I've ever read is The Forest for the Trees by Betsy Lerner. So I like that as a subgenre. I also tend to really like nonfiction that is a little bit of like a genre blend, where it is not straightforwardly one type of nonfiction. And actually both examples I have are genre blends that include true crime. So No Visible Bruises is a blend between true crime stories of domestic violence and murder. So it's a blend of that, but it also has a lot of sort of like traditional sort of sociological reporting kind of stuff in it. This is one of my favorite books of the year. It's very, very good. And then the other kind of genre blend I thought of was I'll Be Gone in the Dark by Michelle McNamara, which combines true crime and memoir. So I like it when somebody does something different with sort of your expectations about the type of book it's going to be. I always think that that's really interesting. And then just generally interesting histories or like sort of micro areas of history tend to be something I like. So The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. This is an example, a forgotten history of how our government segregated America. This is basically a history of the government practice of redlining and all the problems that have come out of it. So I thought that was really interesting. It's also, I also like things that tend to be sort of like history, like subverting your expectations of how something happened in history. I think all three of these kind of fall into that. I really like The Body and Society, Men, Women, and Sexual Renunciation in Early Christianity by Peter Brown, because this is basically, a lot of what this book is explaining what Romans' ideas of gender were in this time and place, and how, like, ideas of gender and how that related to their understanding of what we would call the science of gender. So like their understandings of how men and women's bodies are physically different, they thought it was rooted in what for them was a scientific understanding that therefore then drove gender roles. So it's just really interesting. Like it really changed how I thought about like the ancient traditions around science and around gender. Anyway, super interesting. And then it does talk about sexual renunciation, and it specifically is talking about why sexual renunciation in the context of these kind of upstart philosophies that were emerging kind of around the same time Christianity was, like, it really gives a lot of explanatory power of why that was such a radical, like, political statement, but also like a real renunciation of science as it was understood at the time. Anyway, very interesting. And then White Trash, the 400-year untold history of class in America is fabulous. And again, it's sort of a history that maybe is subverting people's expectation, because there's this very strong American mythos around us being a classless society, or this idea of us not having a specific underclass. And I think this is an incredibly powerful argument about how basically there has always been a white underclass in the US, and that we don't talk about that because it's not congruent with our understandings of our national self-identity. But it is a very interesting book. So interesting histories that like change how you thought about something, I like. Okay, and then let's go to niche literary studies. I really like a literary study. They're fun to read. They can be a little dry, so this falls into the area of I have to be very interested in the subject matter at hand, but all of these are interesting. Studies in Words by C.S. Lewis. Actually, pretty much all of C.S. Lewis's literary criticism I think is very readable and very interesting. He specialized in sort of medieval English literature, so that's kind of his area of specialty, but he also has really interesting essays about fantasy. He was one, along with Tolkien, essentially invented the fantasy genre as it exists in today's world. So he has some interesting stuff on that too, but I like all of C.S. Lewis's literary study stuff. And then two actually on romance. One is Romancing God, Evangelical Women, and Inspirational Fiction. This was like the cornerstone of my thesis. So very much enjoyed this book. Very fascinating kind of a examination of what sociological function inspirational romance fiction has in evangelical circles. It's super interesting. And then For the Love and Money, The Literary Art of the Harlequin, Mills and Boon's Romance by Laura Vivanco is basically a literary study of Harlequin novels, and it's fascinating. Okay, and then again, niche, sciencey kind of books, and I tried to include both like harder sciences and more socially sciences. So one book that I've really enjoyed this year is The Uninhabitable Earth by David Wallace Wells. This is a great example of popular science writing that is scary AF, but very effective, and describes kind of, it games out what if scenarios for what would happen to our planet for each degree warming of Celsius that we reach. Scary, but interesting. Another piece of nature writing that I am reading right now, so can't definitively call it a favorite, but I'm very much enjoying, is Braiding Sweetgrass by, I believe her name is Robin Walls Kimmerer. And that is a fascinating, it's like science writing integrated with memoir, and it has such a lyricism to the prose, it's beautiful. So I like something like that. In terms of a social sciencey kind of thing, Evangelical Identity and Gendered Family Life is fascinating. This is basically looking at why evangelical Christians in America have such specific ideas about gender roles, and then how they essentially don't actually play out in their lived experience, but the espousal of those ideals is very key as a marker of belonging in those communities. So this is a very interesting kind of social sciencey type thing. Why We Get Fat is essentially examining the science, or what we know of it anyway, of what sugar basically does to the body. And sort of a little bit kind of similar to the one I was talking about earlier from Nina Teicholz, but a little bit different, more focused specifically on the science bit of it. Very accessible, very scary, very interesting. A sociological one. This is basically like an anthropological / psychological analysis of what do people mean in American evangelicalism when they say that God talks to them, and talking about how that's like, there's an impulse to pathologize that, but this is more of a like sociological and anthropological examination of what that really means in people's lived experiences. That was super interesting. So Tana Lerman, When God Talks Back, this is very interesting. Oh, and I guess actually, sorry, one more sciencey one is Come As You Are, The Surprising New Science That Will Transform Your Sex Life by Emily Nagurski. This is basically, Emily Nagurski has been a sex educator on college campuses for a very long time. And this is basically a book about the science as we know it, as of the writing at least, of how female sexuality works. And my tagline on this one is always, if you are a woman or you have sex with a woman, you would benefit from reading this. It's very chatty, it's very well done, and it is fascinating. It's a super interesting look at the science behind female arousal. Then one shout out, because I think informational nonfiction can be done well, and I want to shout out Quit Like a Millionaire as a great example of informational nonfiction with very good writing and storytelling baked into it. There are memoir elements in this. It is not a memoir, but I think that the author does a really effective job of incorporating stories to get the overall information in this book across. And I think that it's just very effective at that. So I want to shout out that I love and I'm excited to see informational books that take care to actually be readable and enjoyable as a book and not just as a conveyance of information. And then finally, possibly controversially, I personally really love theology, and a lot of this is actually theology that really is verging into philosophy, but theology that is extremely subversive to the very conservative fundamentalist paradigm that I grew up with in Christianity. So books that really, theology that really challenged a lot of my presuppositions, expanded my consciousness, expanded my worldview, and are just really, all of these, well, not all, there's one exception. Almost all of these are also beautifully written, and I think the actual writing of them is a part of what makes them great. So the only one that's not like beautifully written, but just like exploded my mind hole was Feminist Interpretations of the Bible by Letty M. Russell. I'm not even saying I agree with everything in here, but just like seeing this as a project was very to me. Dietrich Bonhoeffer's Letters and Papers from Prison is the foundation of postmodern theology in a lot of ways, or a foundation for a lot of interesting directions that theology has gone since World War II. Is very funny to me that conservative evangelicals are trying to co-opt Dietrich Bonhoeffer because he's actually a pretty radical thinker, especially in this particular book. This is amazing. The Presence of the Kingdom by Jacques Ellul also comes out of World War II. Jacques Ellul is a French theologian and philosopher, and basically this is a pretty radical, like socialist might be a little too strong, but a very strong ethic of Christianity has to have a liberating, it's like liberation, it's a light version of liberation theology. Oh, I should have included something from that. Oh, I guess I have one of those. Anyway, liberation theology in general is amazing. And this is sort of a light version of that, and it's also beautifully written. For the Life of the World by Alexander Schmemann. So Alexander Schmemann is one of the most important Greek Orthodox theologians, and I think for those of us who have come from a Western tradition of Christianity, there's a lot to be learned from the Orthodox side of the house, so to speak, and I think that this is one of the most beautiful distillations of what Orthodox theology looks like in today's world. So yeah, this is really good. Prayer by Hans Urs von Balthasar. He was a Catholic theologian coming out of Vatican II. Writing in this is beautiful, very dense, very difficult to get through, but this is a beautiful embodiment to me of what Christian meditation could look like, and was very challenging to me in that respect. But yeah, this is great. And then the one that I like the best out of all these, and was probably the most radical, was The Cross and the Lynching Tree by James H. Cone. I would consider this liberation theology, and this really exploded my mind hole. Basically, this is an entire book arguing about, or this is an entire book talking about how the African-American evangelical, they wouldn't self-identify as evangelical, but African-American Protestant theology has been like using the metaphor of Jesus as being lynched for a very long time, and he really just explores ideas around that, and it's beautiful, challenging, really expanded my ideas about soteriology in a very important way, but this is great. So yes, those were, I feel like that ended up just being a rundown of nonfiction that I love, but I hope that that kind of gave you a sense of some of the sort of micro tropes that I enjoy. I don't know, I feel like people can be really intimidated by nonfiction, so I hope this also just gives people a sense of there's just a tremendous amount of scope of what is available to you in the realm of nonfiction, and you could, I don't know, like I think that there's something for almost everyone in nonfiction. They just need the right type of book for them. And I don't know, maybe I'm being overly optimistic, but I really feel like nonfiction is for everyone. And I hope this gave a sense of just like how specific you can get in what you're looking for in nonfiction, and being able to find things that you might like. So definitely let me know one of your favorite kind of like micro types of nonfiction, or like sub-genres. Let me know that in the comments below. And yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please like, subscribe, follow me on the social medias if you are so inclined. I have all that information listed in the description box below, and I think that will do it. I hope you guys are having an absolutely lovely day, and I will just talk to you soon. Bye!